good. All right, well, take it over, Sonoma.
Ernest.
Okay. So I want to welcome everybody here. My name is Laurel McCabe. I'm a professor of psychology at Sonoma State University and the director of the master's program in depth psychology at Sonoma State. So welcome. I want to introduce Robert Haas. Bob is a director and former president of the International Association for the Study of Dreams, which just had their conference in Berkeley. He's also the director of the Dream Science Foundation, which in partnership with IASD provides grant money, research money for research in the scientific study of dreams. And that's partly why we have so many presenters here today. And Bob's also a scientist. He's done a lot of work in the field, and he also has training in Gestalt therapy. So I'm going to turn it over to Bob, and let's welcome Bob.
Okay, thank you, Laurel. We've got 4 presenters this afternoon, and the first one will be Stanley Krippner. I'll introduce him in a minute, Dr. Krippner. Secondly, we'll go to Ernest Hartmann, then to David Kahn, and then I will wrap up at the end with some comments as well in areas that they may have not covered regarding Jung and neuroscience. So that's how we'll conduct it. So we are ready, Laurel, if you are, and Stan, would you like to come up? And as Stan comes up, I'll introduce him. Stanley Krippner, PhD. His talk is on a neuromythological approach to working with dreams. He is a professor of psychology at Saybrook University, San Francisco. He's a fellow in 4 APA divisions and past president of divisions 30 and 32. So, Stan, it's all yours.
Thank you, Bob. Well, it's always a pleasure to be here at Sonoma State because this is where Saybrook University started. We had our offices here at Sonoma State for several years, and then we just grew too big, and we had to move to San Francisco. This morning, I'm going to be talking about a neuromythological approach to working with dreams, and there's a connection between Jung and the neurosciences that has been emerging in the last few years that very few people expected existed. But first I'd like to go back into Greek mythology and Greek philosophy. Many of you are familiar with the word and the name Epictetus, Greek philosopher. And he said it's not so much that happens to us that's important, it's how we interpret what happens to us that's important. Now, virtually the same words were used by Marcus Aurelius, the Roman philosopher, by Aldous Huxley, the English essayist, and by Albert Ellis, the American psychologist. Well, if it's not what happens to us that matters, it means that our view of reality is distorted in some way. And that's distorted because of the way that our brain works. Our brain works as a filter. And the way that the brain filters information coming in is determined by our cultural traditioning and also by the brain itself and the limitations that the senses and the processing of the nervous system handle the input. So, let's take a look at Greek myths. Here, of course, is the well-known story of Narcissus. And this beautiful woman who has been throwing herself at Narcissus has been rebuffed because he's intent at looking at himself in the lake. And she says, is there somebody else, Narcissus? Of course there's somebody else, him. His personal myth is, I am the most beautiful man in the world, and I am worthy of adoration by everybody, including myself. So she misses out, and the gods decided to teach him a lesson. Okay, you want to look at yourself? We're going to turn you into a flower, and you will be able to look at yourself 24 hours a day. And that was their myth about how the Narcissus flower came into being. Well, people do that every day of their lives. They make up stories, and when the stories have a dream element to them and a philosophical element to them, we call them myths. In fact, from a psychological point of view, we can say that a myth is a statement or a story that addresses deep existential concerns, that has an element from the imagination, and that has consequences for human behavior. So a myth can be one sentence long, or it can be volumes long, like the Iliad, like the Odyssey, like Beowulf, etc., etc., etc. Sigmund Freud used myths in talking about the Oedipal complex, the Electra complex, but he never quite knew what women wanted. Well, in this cartoon, he says, what does women want? His wife knows very well what women want. Women want some help around the house. Freud never caught on. He never asked her. So we have four sources of personal myths. We have the biological sources. This, of course, is where the brain comes in, where the neurosciences have a lot to teach us, where evolution comes into the picture. We have the cultural sources, the culture that we live in, our ethnic background, the subcultures. We also have the relationships with significant others, the interpersonal sources, the relationships with our family, with our school mates, with our peers, our lovers, our employers, our employees, and sometimes the strangers. But then we also have transpersonal sources, those moments in time when we're transported beyond our ordinary way of functioning, and we get a glimpse of something that we think is universal and eternal. So, here is a pretty good depiction of one of the sources of personal myths. And this is the biological source of personal myths. But I have to put on the right glasses to view this. Okay. We think mythically because the human brain codes the word in symbols and metaphors. Well, symbols and metaphors occur in dreams, but they also occur in daily behavior. Our genetic inheritance shapes the various primal behaviors and the beliefs that we attach to them. So here we have a father explaining to his son about how birds stake out their territory, and this is very primitive, this is very ancient, this is very biological, not realizing that the fences show that humans are doing much the same thing. So this is something that comes with the territory. This is a biological basis of human myths. And then we have personal experience as a core source of an individual's evolving mythology. Now, if you take a close look at this cartoon, as I am going to take a close look at the cartoon, it says, I love the way, I hated the way that I turned out. Everything my mother did with me, I did the opposite with my genitals. Mother was reserved, I encouraged independence. Mother was
secretive.
Indirect and manipulative, I have been direct. Mother was secretive, I have been open. Mother was evasive, I have been decisive. Now my work is done, Jennifer has grown the exact image of mother. So this is a personal experience. You can see how the family milieu shapes human behavior and personal mythology. But we also have
They can't hear you over
cultural
there, Sam.
sources of personal myths. the cultural beliefs, values, customs, and patterns of reinforcement provide a sometimes invisible but always potent ecology for the individual's every feeling, thought, and action. So here we have an ill-fated couple. Inevitably, their affair ended. Howard worried excessively about what the pack would think, and Agnes just ate the flowers. So never the two shall meet because of these cultural differences. Okay, so now let's take a look at another cultural source of personal myths. Tomorrow they would be mortal enemies, but on the eve of the great hunt, feelings were put aside for the traditional mammoth dance. Ritual connects us with the power and rhythms of nature. Now, ritual is important because ritual is a way that myths are enacted, and ritual seems to resonate with what is happening in the brain. A lot of drumming is used with indigenous people in nature, and when you get that drumming at just the right rhythm, it takes people into the theta range. When we have a lot of theta waves, we have an altered state that enables access to deeper levels of the psyche, that enables symbols, and that enables movements to come up that embed and reinforce and anchor the myth. And then we have the transpersonal sources. In our dreams, we all become artists, interweaving basic perceptions, primal urges, and celestial visions. So, this brings us to how myths evolve. A prevailing myth becomes outmoded. Somebody has been set upon a particular way of action that no longer is working very well for them. A man might hold desperately onto his business, realizing nobody is going to be buying widgets anymore. The economy has moved on, but he wants to manufacture widgets, and nobody is buying. So then a counter myth emerges. I'm going to give up the whole thing. I'm going to stop making widgets. I'm going to go to the South Seas and have a good time. So he sells his widget factory. He goes to the South Seas. Fine, he runs out of money. So he comes back home to the old widget factory. You see, the counter myth is also very unrealistic. So then we have the dialectic. And the old myth is saying, I want to make widgets. And the counter myth is saying, go out and have a good time. Widgets are obsolete. And the two of them argue back and forth until we have a dialectic and a new guiding myth. Look, instead of making widgets, I can do a little spin, and I'll do this little spin, and voila, I can make something that is in keeping with the times, with the electronic industry, and I will call them zidgets. So we have a new product. We have zidgets on the market, and he makes a fortune. His myth has changed because he went through this process of abandoning the old myth, abandoning the counter myth, and bringing the two of them together. Yes, I want something fantastic, but I want also something practical, and that's how zidgets were born. Okay? Okay, stage one. You may learn from a dream, a problem in your work, or from someone you love that a part of your mythology is failing to serve you. And that was when the character in our story found out that nobody was buying widgets anymore. So the second stage is gaining an emotionally informed understanding of the underlying mythic conflict that governs that area of your life. Recognizing the early sources of an old myth. Well, the old myth was grounded in a long line. My family has always made widgets. We made widgets back in the Middle Ages. We made widgets after the Industrial Revolution. We brought the widgets to the United States. Why can't I keep making widgets forever? But then there was the expression of a counter myth. Widgets were obsolete. And so here's where you had the conflict. And then you had to have the synthesis. The dialectic is supported that blends aspects of the old myth and the counter myth into a new mythic image that ideally embodies the most constructive elements of each. And then stage 4, the new myth is a bridge that supports your deepest self to journey into the outside world. The character in our story made zidgets, and the penguin has reached individuation. I've got to be me. I've just got to be me. And this is what sets him aside from all the other penguins. And then the new direction often be summarized in a single mythic statement. And don't forget, when you travel life's highway, don't forget to eat the roses. That's very ancient cow philosophy, okay? But we can sabotage our new myth because that old myth keeps coming back. The teacher is telling the kid, look, you've got to stop this obsessive-compulsive behavior, and I'm going to have you write that on the blackboard 100 times. I will stop my obsessive-compulsive behavior. I will stop my obsessive-compulsive behavior. And you think, it doesn't get better than this. So, here we have everything in a nice diagram. The new experience undermines the prevailing mythic structure, and it brings about a compensation. Widgets are no longer being bought. Okay, I take my money, I run off to the South Seas, have sex, drugs, rock and roll, until the money runs out. But then I have to come back and take my factory and take my desire for something new and exotic and merge them and sell zidgets. And that is how our myths evolve. So, the process goes two ways. We cultivate certain elements of the psyche and repress others. When archetypal and other forces of the psyche push toward consciousness, the psyche creates narratives, new personal myths to explain and contain them. Okay, so this is where dreams come in. There are many psychological functions of dreams. Of course, they process the day residue. They download emotions and repair our emotions, and so we can feel and love and hate the next day. We have problem solving based on memories that are consolidated. And as Jung said, we rehearse for the future. And we correct conscious attitudes. Many of our old dysfunctional myths are corrected during dreams. The dream brings our attention to something that's not working very well anymore. And then we also have transpersonal functions of dreams. Dreams can be telepathic, prophetic, as when Abraham Lincoln dreamed about his own assassination. Dreams can attend to collective concerns. We're having many, many more ecological dreams these days. People dreaming about the fate of the earth. And dreams that reveal a larger picture. People dreaming about spirits, about gods, about goddesses, about something transcendent in their lives. So, our old dysfunctional mythology, we can name, we can identify it, we can blame it, we can say we want to get rid of it, and we can tame it. We can throw it away, or we can morph it and put some nips and tucks in it so it serves our purposes. And we go into our deep mythic wisdom to do this. We see it, we free it, and we be it. So, the value of dreams in this whole process, I think, is very obvious. Because when we have conflicts in our dreams, those conflicts might be symbols and metaphors for a mythic conflict in our everyday life. In a few minutes, you will be hearing about big dreams. These big dreams often have to deal with our own personal mythology. I work a lot with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, among veterans, and many people like to change the dream. And I think that there's a deeper way to do that. Rather than change the dream, change the personal myth behind the dream. a soldier keeps having dreams about his best friend being blown to bits, and he said, I should have been there to protect him. No, you see, that's the wrong personal myth. The personal myth is terrible things happen in war. My friend was killed. I will live my life in such a way as to do honor to my friend. Okay? Another veteran inadvertently killed some civilians, including a little girl. Oh, I am such a terrible person. I can never be forgiven. My peers will not forgive me. God will not forgive me. I can't forgive myself. That's a personal myth. Very, very dysfunctional. Wrong personal myth. Again, terrible things happen in war. And I made a mistake. But I will establish a scholarship fund and get some money to send children from that country to school in their own country, to bolster families, and I will work through this guilt so I no longer feel guilty, so I have something positive to offer. So once somebody takes action about a nightmare, changes the personal myth, and brings this change into daily life, then the nightmare will possibly still reoccur, but no longer as a nightmare, but as an instructive dream. As Carl Jung said back in 1916, a dream, like every other element in the psychic structure, is a product of the total psyche. Hence, we may expect to find in dreams everything that has ever been of significance in the line of reality, in the line of the life of humanity. Just as human life is not limited to this or that fundamental instinct, but builds itself up from a multiplicity of instincts, needs, desires, and physical and psychic conditions, so the dream cannot be explained by this or that element in it. However beguilingly simple such an explanation may appear to be. We can be certain that it is incorrect because no simple theory of instinct will ever be capable of grasping the human psyche, that mighty and mysterious thing, nor consequently its exponent, the dream. In order to do anything like justice to dreams, we need an interpretive equipment that must be laboriously fitted together from all branches of the humane sciences. So, in other words, if we are to do justice with dreams, this is an interdisciplinary affair. And we can pull together from the neurosciences, we can pull together from the social sciences, from the behavioral sciences, to grasp this mysterious and wondrous phenomenon called the dream. And we must also remember that when we deal with dreams, we're basically dealing with a dream report, not the dream itself. We're dealing with a dream report that is all that we remember about the dream. But even if we do not remember the dream itself, it's still helping us. It's still consolidating those memories. It still is helping to download emotions. It's still helping plan for the future, and it still is revealing and concealing personal mythology that we can put to use in our daily life.
Thank you, Stan. Very good. We have about 10 minutes for questions for Stan. And Steve, do you want to manage the questions? We have a question
here. Let me go ahead. I'm going to ask the first question, but it's a technical one, and I'm going to email that out. We're getting
then we have one out. We do have one out here as well. So
okay, and then we'll go around to the other sites. One technical piece. We're getting one data stream from you guys, which is okay, but if it's possible to push the PowerPoint on one channel and the live video on the other channel, that gives the audience both pieces. Do you know if your tech guys are scan converting and need to use one channel, or is it possible to push the two channels? And if you can just pass that message on and let us know whenever we get the chance. It doesn't have to be right now. One thing to be looking at.
Might be difficult with what we're having to do with the mics, too.
It could be, and if you're not able to do it, that's fine. And if that's the case, just as long as the home audience can realize we're combining into one stream, and that's okay.
Okay.
Go ahead and ask your question there, and then I'll go around to email as well as Asheville and England. But start at Sonoma, and then we'll go around.
Okay. Everyone, push your mic on.
Push the button. Keep it pushed when you talk.
Oh, hello? Okay, there we go. I had a question regarding one of the slides, the dream functions. There were 4 functions, one of which was to correct failing myths, and I wanted to get that down, however, I didn't have the opportunity.
I can't hear a word. What is this question?
He would like you to repeat the 4 functions of the transformational process, what those 4 things were. Start over.
Okay, so you're asking about the 4 functions of dreaming?
Yes.
Counter myth.
Well, first of all, this is a product of human evolution. Dream specialists and researchers are divided whether or not dreams per se were adaptive, but they certainly are adaptive in the lives of human beings today, even if they were not adaptive from an evolutionary point of view. And first of all, the dreams consolidate emotions. They help us to remember what worked in the past and what might work in the future. You look at what happens with rats as they are going through REM, rapid eye movement sleep, and you see the same lights going on in their brain that were going through their brain when they were running the maze. So they're remembering the best way to run the maze so that they can find the cheese the next time they're in the experiment. Well, the second function that I mentioned was the downloading of emotions. If you didn't have dreams, all those emotional residues would be with you the next day, and you'd be grumpy, and you'd be bitchy, and you'd be nasty, and you'd go around, insulting people. But dreams, you see, we have more unpleasant dreams than pleasant dreams, and that's one of the reasons why. All this unpleasantness gets filtered through the dream. We deal with it in the dream, and we awake, for the most part, bright and fresh the next morning. The third function is planning for the future, rehearsing, the rehearsing aspect of the dream, where we're rehearsing for the future, and so we're better prepared for the oncoming day. And then the fourth function is self-correcting. There's a self-organizing aspect to each dream. The dreams don't come full-blown like Athena from the brain of Zeus. No, there's a step-by-step process where a part of the brain, usually the visual motor system, is evoked, and you get a little image here, another image there, and then these connect by neural networks with each other, usually around some emotion, what Jung would call a complex, and what I would call a personal myth, usually a dysfunctional personal myth. And once you remember that, what Ernest Hartmann calls that central image, and once you remember what the conflict is, then you can start correcting it. Sometimes the dream corrects itself from within the dream, but usually it's something that prompts us to correct it with psychotherapy, with counseling, with self-introspection, with help from friends, etc. Well, that's quite a heavy order for dreams, but I think you can see how dreams, whether we remember them or not, are there to help us to regulate our psyche and are there to give us some assistance for the coming day.
Thank you.
Okay. We have time for one more quick question. I think Steve has one from somewhere else.
Yeah, let's try England. England, do you all have a question for the first seminar? England, go ahead if you have one.
No, we'll pass, thanks.
England passes. Asheville, question from Asheville. Asheville passes. So Sonoma, you get a second question if you'd like it.
Okay. Hold your mic down, mic button down.
Stan, you talked about changes in personal myth and the dialectic and the new synthesis that arises. Could you talk a little bit how that would work for a cultural myth, like cultural myths that are active in our culture, like American exceptionalism or the myth of the frontier, or Manifest Destiny, those culturally active myths, and how you see changes there?
Yeah, that's a good question, because this whole notion of the conflicting personal myths I actually picked up from cultural mythology, the work of Claude Levi-Strauss, a famous ethnologist who died recently at the age of 100. And he talked about what happens when two cultures merge, bringing their myths with them. And usually, the resulting combination of myths is stronger than each myth was by itself. For example, when the lower kingdom of Egypt and the upper kingdom of Egypt joined, rather than throwing out the gods of one area and the gods of another area and the different crowns, they merged the gods. Now they had twice as many gods and goddesses, twice as much power, and the crown became much more elaborate. The flat crown of one kingdom, the domed crown of another kingdom became united. And so Claude Levi-Strauss noted what was happening in cultural mythology, and then it dawned upon me, well, this is also what happens in personal mythology. If you can find the best of the old myth and the best of the counter myth, you can merge them together into a new myth, and your life will be twice as powerful, twice as enriching, and twice as joyous.
Okay. Thank you. I think we have time for one more. Okay. Go ahead, Cedric.
Oh, okay. Stanley, my question is, for example, if I'm going to the other culture, for example, I'm from Russia and I'm going to US and I'm living here, is it working that my personal myths starting to change and I'm growing in my personal development, and then I'm going to the other cultures, and then in the one moment can I make some kind of universal cultures in myself? So like universal myths for all cultures.
Okay, I'm going to have to summarize that a little bit because we're running out of time. First of all, I don't think there's a universal myth for all cultures. I think that each culture has its own myth. There are universal themes, and these themes come up in dreams, but each culture is sort of myth-specific. Okay, two things can happen. When the Europeans invaded North America, they brought their own myths with them. They weren't interested in Indian myths. They destroyed Indian myths. They superimposed their own god and religion on the Native Americans. And what happened? It lingers today. Native Americans have a lot of alcoholism, sex abuse, unemployment, because the Europeans refused to learn from the Native Americans. However, something very different happened in Brazil. The Brazilians brought slaves, the Europeans brought slaves from Africa to Brazil, and again superimposed their own religion, Christianity, upon the Brazilians, but the Africans were clever enough to integrate the African gods with the Christian gods. And once slavery was over, you had new religions emerging, the African Brazilian religions that had the Christian, that had the Native American, that had the African, and you have vibrant religious groups in Brazil today, Candomblé, Umbanda, and now we have the ayahuasca religions coming into the picture. So we have living mythology in Brazil that you have in a few other places in the world, and very, very vital spiritual traditions. So when you come in from the outside, be prepared to leave your myths at the door and see what you can learn from the culture that you are visiting. and then maybe eventually some synthesis will take place. A good anthropologist listens for the first few weeks or even months that they come into a new culture, and then gradually they begin to learn the culture, learn the language, learn the customs, and give honor to the traditions that they visit and what can be gained for science and for daily living from what they've come upon.
Well, thank you very much, Stan. I think we're out of time for questions. I hope that's okay, Jody. Catch you later. At this point in time, I'd like to give Stanley another hand. Excellent. And our next presenter will be Ernest Hartmann. Ernest's talk is on research studies of the big dream. Ernest was professor of psychiatry at Tufts University School of Medicine in Boston. He was the director of the Sleep Disorders Center at Newton Wesley Hospital, and he is one of our past presidents of the International Association for the Study of Dreams and the first editor-in-chief of our journal, our professional journal, Dreaming. So I now invite Ernest to the stage. And here's the, that won't have yours on it. Okay. It'll be there at the back. No, we need it put on the back screen.
Okay, thank you very much, Bob.
That's where we're going.
So, thank you very much, Bob. And thank you all. Thank you, Jung, for bringing us all together. And, now, I've heard a lot of attempts to connect neurology and Jung today, and I don't think we're quite connected. I will not do very much of that, but Bob Haas may give us a few slides that show more detail. At the end of my talk, I'll talk a bit about brain biology, but I'm going to give you a more simple-minded talk, looking at dreaming in general, and especially Jung's idea of the big dream, and see what we can make of that, whether we can characterize that. So I hope you all know what a big dream is. A powerful dream, a dream that stays with you. You probably all know Freud had one dream. It involved his bunch of bird-beaked men carrying his mother's body. It wasn't clear whether she was dead or alive. Stayed with him his whole life. Jung, as you know, had his one dream about descending to different levels and finding a huge phallic pillar in the basement. Today, Murray Stein presented two very clear big dreams today, the Hagia Sophia and the Lord coming down, and the figure 8 serpent with orchids on its back. So wonderful big dreams. Those are dreams that we remember. And in fact, both Murray and Margaret remembered their patients' dreams for years. I've had a few dreams too that have stuck with me. So what differentiates a big dream from an ordinary dream? And I have to put this in I can get ahead a little bit and say, for me at least, discussing my own and my colleagues' dreams, it seemed to me that the power of the imagery was very important. But I want to get to some actual research, which is my research on the nature and functions of dreaming, which for me is especially the central image. Okay, there's the nature and functions of dreaming I've written home. No. So what we did, what I and my collaborators do in studying dreaming, we started with what seemed to be the simplest case, a dream that we've seen many times in an adult who has recently experienced a trauma, which could be a fire, auto accident, a rape, an attack. And the dream we find, I hope you can read hope everyone in Zurich and England and here can read the slides, because I won't read them all. But I'm on the beach, etc., and a huge wave comes and swoops me away. That part that's emphasized is the central image of the dream. And the reason I think that's so important, in fact, it's paradigmatic, is because this person was nowhere near the ocean, escaped from a fire in western Massachusetts. She's not dreaming what actually happened. She's dreaming the emotion. I am terrified. I'm overwhelmed. I'm swept away. she's dreaming the emotion. So that's the simplest case. And we have many, the next few slides show a number of anecdotal examples, and we'll get to data later. But, fear and terror can be pictured by central images like that. You, way, a burning house, gang of evil men chasing me. Helplessness, vulnerability, very often pictured simply in the central image of a dream. Grief. These grief examples all occurred in three persons whose mother, a simple, straightforward, beloved mother, had just died. All right, so we did a lot of anecdotal examples, clinical examples, and to my mind, we start with clinical examples. This is important for some of our Jungian and Freudian friends. You cannot do research in the consulting room. You can start in the consulting room. You can get good ideas. But if you have an idea, you don't have to take it to a brain laboratory, but you have to look at it more carefully, more quantitatively, try to pin things down. So we did that, starting with this idea of a powerful central image. We've got a scoring sheet. I won't go into the details, but this can be applied to any written dream, your own dreams, patients' dreams, or usually we have groups of dreams from students or from people who've experienced a trauma, and the judge, the scorer, simply is asked, is there an image, is there a powerful image? At least 50% of the time they identify something. Then secondly, how powerful is it? How intense is it from 0 to 3? And then they're asked also what emotion might be pictured. And the intensity score, the 0 to 3, it's very simple-minded. Tidal wave thing, we get a 3. People can agree pretty well. We can't say exactly what we're measuring, like most psychological studies, but it's got good reliability. Judges can agree on is there a central image and how powerful is it. So we've used this kind of scoring. So here's the tidal wave living here. All our scorers score, all the judges say 3.0 on this. This is a really powerful dream. Okay, now we gathered some data using this. I'll go through this fairly quickly. The details aren't totally important, but this shows that in a group of about 50 students, the dreams, most recent dream and the dream that stands out, on a blind basis was scored as having much more powerful, more intense central images than daydreams. This one is sort of a laboratory study using Bob Stickgold's nightcap. People were wearing a cap that identified eye movements and a few other things. So it turns out when we had this is over 1,000 instances, turns out that the instances that came from REM had was scored as having much stronger central images than non-REM and then waking. Sometimes the people were sort of buzzed while they were awake. Okay, now this gets a little more interesting. These are 10 different cases of adults, like the initial tidal wave thing, adults who've experienced a single important trauma, a rape, an attack. And it shows that in all 10 cases, again, these were scored on a blind basis. There were long series of dreams, from 10 to 100 dreams, different people. The intensity of the central image was definitely higher in these people than in students. There's the same data in another way. The trauma group had much higher central image intensity. So these people presumably are in some emotional state, traumatized, stressed, emotionally aroused. They have more intense central images in their dreams. This is a different study. Now, these are not adults whom we know have been abused in some way. This is simply a group of 300 students, each of whom turned in a recent dream, and they were scored on a blind basis. Each of the students also filled out a questionnaire asking a number of questions, such as, have you ever experienced abuse, either sexual abuse or physical abuse, in childhood or in adulthood, or more recently? So there were 4 questions. Most students checked no to all those. About 70 of the 300 students did check yes to one of those 4 questions, and it turned out that their dreams have much higher central image intensity. So this central image does pick up something. We don't know exactly what happened to the students, but they say they were abused. That's all we know. They were presumably more emotional, more aroused, more anxious, more stressed in some way. It was picked up by the dream in the way we can measure quantitatively. And then one more study. This is one we did a systematic study of a kind of traumatic event we all experience, which is the attacks of 9/11/01. Now, I couldn't do anything. People sent me lots of, I had this wonderful dream about 9/11. I couldn't do anything with these individual dreams. This was a matter of we found 44 individuals all over the United States who had been keeping dream journals, who had been writing down their dreams for many years. So nothing changed in 2001. We found 44 people who were willing to send us 20 dreams, the last 10 in their records before 9/11 and the first 10 afterwards. So we had 20 dreams from each of these 44 people. We had 880 dreams. We gave them all random numbers and scored them for central image, intensity, and emotions pictured, and also a bunch of other things. Now, some people said, well, you won't find anything except more dreams about towers and airplanes afterwards. But actually what we found, this is hard to interpret. It's just once we broke the code of reassigned, this is central image intensity after minus before. So if there's red above the bar, they had more intense dreams. After, more red below the bar is before. So the predominant red stuff is above the bar. There was much more intensity after than before. And again, this is about the only thing. This is a t-test. We also have an ANOVA. The central image intensity was higher afterwards. The dreams were not scored as longer, more vivid, more detailed. And interesting enough, there were not significantly more buildings, planes. We did make up a measure of general attacks. There were somewhat more attacks afterwards. And we made up a nightmare-like scale, slightly more of those. And the emotions I'll go through quickly because it's not as easy to score all these emotions. But these emotion slides show that in the after dreams there was somewhat more fear, terror, and helplessness, vulnerability. And there was somewhat less happiness and joy pictured, as you might expect. But the clearest finding was simply the power, the intensity of the central image. They were not all tidal waves by any means. There were all kinds of images, but they were more powerful afterwards. Okay, so that's sort of the center of our research. I don't know if you can read the conclusions. Consistent with previous studies, the intensity of the central image is sort of a measure of emotional arousal, emotional power. Okay, so now we tried to study big dreams. And, big is Jung has a way of, I think it was Jung's term, people keep referring to as Jung. My Jungian friends say he doesn't always use that term. But anyway, for research studies, we defined big in a number of different ways. One way was simply memorable. So the first study was a study of 37 students. There were 74 dreams. In each one we had a recent dream and a dream they said that stands out. So this is always labeled by the dreamer, dream that stands out. And again, these were scored on a blind basis. The dream that stands out had much more intense central imagery. The second one is a bigger sample that Kelly Berkeley and I did. Again, the recent dream, or they call it a memorable dream. Again, the memorable dreams had much more intense imagery, central image. The important thing about that study, which doesn't show up in the slide, is we also tried to compare recent dreams to memorable dreams on a whole bunch of different scales, the Hall and Van de Kessel scales, and they did not show any clear differences. The one thing that clearly differentiated memorable dreams from recent dreams was intensity of the central image. In this study, we had, I think, for how many? I can't quite read, but for 57 people. 57 people each sent us an important dream and an unimportant dream. Some people, of course, said, I have no unimportant dreams. But, okay, so the important dream and the less important. Some of them labeled it as less important. Again, the ones they labeled as an important dream had definitely higher central image intensity. And this was even clearer. This was a class of students that Roger Hudson was working with in Ohio. He worked with a class who worked for great detail with what they called a highly significant dream. And again, those had very high central image intensity. And this is a group of impactful dreams from Deleuze Barrett's book about dreams that seem to produce a scientific or artistic discoveries, the dreams that really, according to the dreamer again, resulted in something important, a great work of art or a great discovery. And again, the impactful dreams have very high central image intensity. Okay, so I'm saying that it's the central image that makes big dreams big. Big dreams are not characterized by an interesting plot or weird characters. They're characterized by powerful central imagery. Okay, now I go in a lot of different directions with this, but I think, just a few days ago, I went to the idea of the center of the central image of the dream is very much like the central image of a poem. The dream is the beginning of a work of art. But today, I guess I'm going to try to approach brain biology, but we won't get very far. But my group has been thinking of mental functioning in terms of a continuum: focused waking, lucid waking, daydreaming, fantasy, reverie, and dreaming. This is I don't know if it's worth talking about. Well, yeah, this is counterintuitive. Some of us like to think that dreaming is one thing. Dreaming comes from some totally different place. Daydreaming, fantasy, everything else is something else with a wall between them. I call that the Meteorite position. I don't think so. As some of you may know, there's a lot of data by Reinsel and Antrobus, by Klinger, by Jerome Singer, and by myself and kind of stuff showing there's a lot of overlap between dreaming and daydreaming and fantasy and so on. Maybe not surprisingly. So I think it's worth thinking of a continuum rather than all these other forms of activity are in one place, dreaming in another. And of course, when we talk about these forms of mental functioning, we're talking about basically forms of cortical activation. And this is just very, very sketchy. This just shows that it's really a sketch of the only important part is the frontal cortex. It just shows in focused waking the DLPFC, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, is highly activated. Ventromesial cortex is relatively inactivated. It moves. So dreaming, assuming that you don't have MRIs and PET scans of dreaming per se, but if you can, for a moment, talk about REM sleep, then it's the other way. In between, it moves gradually in that direction. I think of the daydreaming pictures. That's closest to what's been called the default network. But anyway, just this sketch just shows there's less dorsolateral prefrontal activity and more of the others. Oh, this is hard to see. These are some of the areas that are more active or less active in the REM sleep. I think Bob Haas will show this in more detail. So there are certain areas of the brain, but I'm doing it sketchily because we do not know. We cannot pretend we're going to make a precise mapping, I don't think. But there are changes in brain activation regions. But something that I think is going to turn out to be more important is there's a difference in spread of activation. This is merely a sketch of spread of activation in the cortex. Of focused thought is kind of directed ABCD. Lucid thought is spread out a little bit. Dreaming is even more spread out. We don't yet have real data for that. I have a slide. This was supposed to be a video just showing spread of activation, but it doesn't really show very much. But the idea would be that during dreaming, there's more, not just different areas of the cortex activated, but a broader spread of activation. And so along those lines, I would suggest, but this is a hope. This is not based purely on data. So that a big dream probably involves especially strong amygdala activation, not just the amygdala limbic system, and especially strong interaction of amygdala, hippocampus, striatum, and cortex, and an especially broad spread of activation in the cortex. But I'm not insisting on that. That's my guess of the neurobiology of a big dream. Okay, I think that's it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Great.
Thank you very much.
Do we have a question here in Sonoma? Steve, do you want us to go first?
Let me start around the other way, and we'll kind of see how that goes. Let me do an internet one, because we haven't done internet questions yet. As you all have internet questions, please send them to us. Again, exit full screen on your streamer, and then click on that little dialog balloon and send that to us. This one, I'll open up, can really go to any presenter. It was sent a little bit earlier from Damon Hansen. And his question on dreams is, in approaching dreams, how do we differentiate random, meaningless firings from relevant contents in our unconscious? Also, what of those who experience a dearth of dreams and have tremendous difficulty remembering them? What do you think it means when someone has such difficulty using dreams to access our unconscious and thereby move towards individuation? What would you suggest someone does to increase frequency and clarity of memory of dreams? I'll open that up to anyone there, and then we'll maybe go to England.
Well, it sounds like a thesis.
I'll try briefly. I've written 4 or 5 books that answer most of those questions. I mean, we all agree that there's activation, hyperconnectivity, which by the way, that Stein attributed to Jung. Freud's condensation is exactly the same thing, hyperconnectivity. That's the one place where Freud and Hobbes and everybody else agrees that there's hyperconnectivity. But is it random? Is there simply random activation? I obviously think not. And even Hobson lately has told me he doesn't really think it's random. And as you've seen from my slides, I obviously feel that it's hyperconnectivity, but directed by the underlying emotion. The powerful emotion is what affects the dream. So I think of it as not at all random. Now, in terms of who doesn't remember dreams at all, there's a whole literature on that too. And in my work, some of you may be familiar with my work on thick and thin boundaries. Some people have relatively thick boundaries in many, many senses. Thick boundaries is A, B, C, D. I'm a man, you're a woman. Vive la différence. Black versus white. Thin boundaries is more shades of gray merging. It turns out that people who have thick boundaries in all those ways tend to remember relatively few dreams. People of thin boundaries remember much more dreams and more exciting dreams too. So there's that basic difference. But it's not, it can change. And for instance, long-term therapy is one way for things to change. But there are many ways which boundaries in dream recall can change. But let someone else answer some more of those many questions.
Okay. Thank you, Ernest. I hope that at least got most of the idea across. Do we have another question? Yes. Push it.
Okay, so in the experiment about the abused versus non-abused students, you checked whether the time of the abuse was early in their life or later in their life. Did that make a difference in terms of the intensity of the
No, as far as we could tell, it did not make a difference. But we didn't really have data for that. We only had enough. We only had a large enough N to really do the study on if we put all 4 questions together. But we did look briefly at the questions individually. It was not very clear. It seemed as though any kind of abuse could produce this sort of emotional activation or stress that would result in the more powerful dream images.
So that speaks to the neurobiology that it may be more long-term. Long-term.
Well, yes. I mean, it's hard to say. The event, certainly long ago abuse can have long-term effects, but presumably it would have long-term effects by producing, biological brain changes. Now, brain is still abused 20 years later, and that shows up in the dream, I would think.
Okay, thank you. Steve, do we have any? We have one more here, but do you have anything from other sites?
Let's ask around. Why don't we ask England, and then we'll ask Asheville. England, do you have a question day for the presenters?
Can we make a comment on the previous question?
Absolutely.
Just this question of people who find it difficult to access their dreams. Working in long-term therapy is one of the things that Dr. Hartmann pointed out. And this is what I find, that often the patient who comes and says, I don't remember my childhood and I don't dream. Those two things go almost hand in hand. And that if one waits, in the analytic relationship and waits. As the relationship builds, so access to the dreaming process builds. I think we saw that in the case of Holly, and it moving from very archetypal forms to something much more humanized and personal. That's just a comment I wanted to make in terms of access to the dreaming process. Thank you.
Yeah. No, thank you very much, Margaret. No, I certainly agree with that. I've done many years of clinical work. I've also seen this. This one patient I saw who had very, very thick boundaries in all the senses we've talked about. He said he had no dreams, no interest in dreams, almost never dreamed. When he finally did remember a dream, it was fascinating. His first dream was I was in the works of a large cement dam. I was inside the walls, and there were thick 10-foot thick cement walls with a little window on the top. But he gradually, as he began to remember dreams, they gradually became more ordinary, I'd say. But of course, that's another point. Ordinary is a difficult word. Ordinary dreams brought to Freudian analysts turned out to be somewhat different from ordinary dreams brought to Jungian analysts. And for instance, the long dream that your patient Harley described first about walking through these buildings and stables, and some parts were better shaped and stuff. That strikes me as a dream that I've often heard brought to a Jungian analyst. It's very, very much the dream sort of is picturing the psyche and so on. And in my research studies, I seldom get dreams quite like that. But so the dream is always a relationship. It's always a transference project when you're in therapy.
It was very interesting. That patient had a degree in classics, and I think it pervaded her dreaming process.
Thank you very much, Mark. Any other, Steve? I think we have one here.
Let me ask, any other questions here in the room? Yeah, Carl, go ahead. Make sure your light is pushed.
On the subject of remembering dreams, as the therapeutic relationship develops and trust and acceptance strengthens, that encourages the remembering of dreams on an interpersonal basis. What about on a neurological basis? Are there any neurological factors that play into remembering or not remembering dreams?
That's a very interesting question. I'd interpret that as have studies been on looking at neurological changes in someone who is now remembering more dreams. I don't have any data on that. Do you know anything about that, Bob? Because Bob has reviewed a great deal of the...
Not on differences between individuals who have made an internal change and their ability now to remember dreams. I don't know of any correlational or otherwise studies on that. There certainly are some reasons neurologically why we have a difficult time remembering dreams. Our working memory is pretty well shut down, and the precuneus and other centers of the brain responsible for that are fairly well diminished or demodulated, so that forms a basis for making it difficult to remember dreams. But the differences in the change in recall of dreams based on internal psychological change, I don't know of any studies. Do you, David? Yeah. Got it?
Thank you. Well, there's been a slew of papers, trying to address that question. Can you neurologically guess who are going to be the high recallers and the low recallers? And there's no definitive answer except that those folks who are good at, when they're awake, at spatial visualization seem to be better recallers of dreams. So if they're good at spatial navigation, visual imagination, they're good recallers of their dreams.
Thanks. Jody.
Am I on? Okay. Yeah, it's kind of along the same theme. I was curious when Stanley Krippner was speaking, the statement that dreams help us whether remembered or not. And I'm curious about that from the neuropsychological standpoint. We talked about how we reinforce new attitudes when we're aware of the content and the meaning of our dreams, and we can change. So presumably there's brain changes going on with that. So I guess the question I have is, how does the unremembered dream differ from the remembered and worked on dream from a neuropsychological viewpoint?
Well, it's a big question. I've in a lot of books and papers I've talked about the basic functions of dreaming, which involve, I think of it as integrating new material with old material, guided by emotion, building an emotional memory system. And that's part of the cortical activation of REM sleep. That I'm fairly sure that happens in everyone. I mean, people who do not remember any dreams, not many of them show up at these meetings, but I do know many people, and they're very normal. They don't go crazy from not remembering their dreams. REM sleep and the cortical part of REM sleep, which we can roughly call dreaming, is presumably having a basic biological function. But then you can when you do remember a dream, you have a whole series you can use. I call that the use of dreams, which is like a higher order function. When you remember your dreams, you can use them in self-knowledge, you can use them in therapy with others, you can use them in creating works of art and science, and so on.
Thanks, Ernest. Also, when we get to my talk, you'll see that we'll be talking about some of the centers that are activated in REM, or released REM stage dreaming. And you'll see that those centers should be operating and doing their function whether you remember the dream or not. You know, the recall of the dream doesn't have a great deal to do with what processing is taking place during those stages. Recall certainly helps, like Ernest indicated, but I think the self-healing process happens. Okay, thanks. Okay, it looks like we hit. Yes, one more question, and then we will take a short, maybe 10-minute break. Is that good, Steve?
Yeah, that sounds good. That'd be fine.
Okay, so we'll take one more question from Sonoma, unless there's a hot one from someplace else. So go ahead.
Okay.
And hold it down.
Yeah, this is by way of observation. Maybe there's a question in there somewhere for you, Ernest. You started off talking about big dreams in relation to trauma. And my personal experience of big dreams from people that I've worked with is that they're mostly very positive, and they almost feel like a gift or a magical mystery tour. So what would be your observation about that?
Well, yes, personally I would agree. I have a few big dreams in my mind that I've had that have been fairly positive. Very positive, in fact. All I can say is when we did the studies, and in which a lot of students or others or patients filled out questionnaires and wrote down dreams, there the ones after trauma obviously were not so positive. But yes, I've had some very positive ones. I have, if you remember that list of emotions, no one knows how to categorize emotions. They go all the way from 3 basic emotions to 100, depending what system you're using. But among the 18 emotions I had, the first 2 were I could call them nightmare emotions: fear, terror, and then helplessness, vulnerability. Those are the ones that were scored most after trauma. Those are the ones that went up a little bit after 9/11. So those, of course, you could call negative. But, for instance, after 9/11, or in fact, did my own series, there were a lot of positive emotions too. And there's one fascinating emotion on the positive side that was called awe, wonder, mystery. And that's scored not infrequently. And when I think of my 2 or 3 big dreams, that would be the emotion that seemed to be pictured. The emotion we call awe, wonder, and mystery, which is certainly usually, I think of it as more positive. But no, it wouldn't have to be. I mean, there's the idea of the awesome God or angel. It's not necessarily positive. But, yeah. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's give her a hand. Okay, if we could, and if this works for the rest of those joining us, let's try to take about a 10-minute break, which will allow us to actually get back in 15 minutes, but let's try to get back in 10, okay? So we can start right at about, well, it's 12:25 here, but so 10-minute break, please.
That sounds good. Do remember microphones might be active, so again, keep your conversations to minimum inside the room. We don't have audio yet for you, Bob.
Okay, you do now. You wouldn't have wanted it before.
We wouldn't want okay.
Oh, is this your talk? Oh, sorry.
I mean, if I can't see it.
Okay, I was just trying to do this. Okay. Just let us know when you want to start.
Yeah, go ahead. We're all set here, so you may begin when ready.
Okay, thank you, everyone. We're back. We have two more presenters to go, David Kahn, and then I will wrap up at the ending. And if we do have some more time, we'll have some questions at the end. But at this point, I would like to introduce David Kahn, PhD. His talk is the neuroscience looks at aspects of the self, the brain basis of self, and the emergence of self. And David is an instructor in psychiatry at Harvard Medical School and advisor to the IASD Executive Committee. He was a past president and former board chair of the International Association for the Study of Dreams as well. So David, take it away.
Okay. First question I ask myself, and you probably are asking the same question, why bother? Why bother studying the neuroscience of the self? What does it add? Well, that's what I'm going to talk about in the remaining 25 or 30 minutes. But very quickly, for me, in addition to just being curious, as scientists are, it's more information. It can give me some insight, just like knowing about how my digestive system works. I get more insight than if I didn't know. So looking at how neuroscience can define the self gives me another dimension of looking at the self. What is the self anyway? What do we mean by the self? Can we even define the self? Well, generally speaking, if you ask somebody on the street, what do you mean by the self? Well, they might say it's what I'm doing, it's what I'm acting, it's how I feel, it's all of that kind of stuff. And so we have that as a basis, this gut feeling of what the self is. It's who I am. What can we add to that? What has Jung added to that? And we've heard a lot about that. And the young woman from Taiwan asked a great question, neuroscience of the self. Okay, so first, I want to give you a roadmap of where we're going in the next 20, 25 minutes. What is the self? A bit of Jung's definition. Let's look at what neuroscience says about the self. We'll look at brain networks, specific areas of the brain that have more or less been identified with the self, self-awareness, personality traits, etc. We'll look at awake and conscious focusing. We'll look at daydreaming. Has anybody started? Thanks. An honest person. Asleep and dreaming. Then we're going to look at disorders of the self. I actually don't like that name. I would prefer alternative orders of the self, or something like that. It's not, doesn't slip off the tongue easily. But the only reason for looking at, quote, disorders of the self is to see if we can learn something about the self from looking at how the self changes when the brain changes, because that's what we're talking about here, the self and the brain basis of the self. Then we'll put out a speculative suggestion on how dreams, the dream narrative, may be constructed. And we'll look at the self-organizing idea that Stanley actually mentioned. And then we'll wrap up and see what conclusions we can make from the talk. So, the first is, okay, what does Jung have to say about the self? Basically, as you know more than I, Jung's basic idea is that the conscious and the unconscious complement each other. And as we will see, and as Ernest pointed out, there's a continuum from focused, awake, daydreaming, sleep, and dreaming. So the conscious and the unconscious, the daydreaming, the focused, awake, the sleep, and dreaming complement each other. And we'll try to look at that in some detail neurologically. And to Jung, our self is not our ego. It's not who we thought we were. Our self is rather who we really are. The known and the unknown. The integrated, and he doesn't say what is not integrated, but the integrated and what has yet to be integrated. I like that. He continues, our perception of ourselves is our ego, but our true self is a great deal more. The ego is the center of consciousness, whereas the self is the center of our total personality. It includes consciousness, unconsciousness, and the ego. The self is realized as the product of individuation, process by which we integrate our personality, the conscious, the unconscious, and the ego. So, the process of individuation is the conscious coming to terms with one's own inner center or self. Man becomes whole, integrated, calm, fertile, and happy when the process of individuation is complete. When the conscious and the unconscious have learned to live at peace and to complement one another. Okay, and what about the neuroscience definition of the self? Neuroscience attempts to define the self as emerging from the neural activity of our brains. Our major thesis is that neuroscience is, in fact, capable of defining the self. You know, it's actually remarkable that neuroscience even supports the fuzzy-wuzzy idea, if you will, of the self, that we can find a brain basis for the self. Finding a brain basis for the self places the study of the self on a firm scientific basis. Nonetheless, the neuroscience of the self is not at odds with the Jungian theory of the self, even though they emphasize different aspects of the self. Before we get into specific brain processes, let's run through more general ideas of the self. So, we can think of the self as giving a feeling of knowing, that there is an automatic, unprompted sense of self that is the protagonist of the experience. As stated, this was stated by Antonio Damasio in one of his most recent books, Self Comes to Mind. A feeling of knowing. Self, feeling of knowing. Being the protagonist of what I am doing. And B.S. Ramachandran in his latest book, The Telltale Brain. And he, Ramachandran, suggests we look at these aspects of the self. How do we think of the self more generally before we get into the brain processes help defining the self? Unity. A person feels like one person who, he or she, identifies as oneself. Unity. You identify someone as yourself. Continuity. One feels a sense of continuity and identity throughout your life. Embodiment. One feels anchored, centered, a part of your own body. Embodiment. Privacy, one's mental life is your own. And social embedding. A person feels he or she is part of a community. You're part of a tribe. You're part of IASD. You're part of your coffee group. You're part of, I have a great wine tasting group that's been going on for 34 years. I feel that, part of the self is social embedding, as well as privacy, almost diametrically opposed, but they're all part of how we define the self. And Ramachandran goes on and says free will is also an important part of the self, that I can decide to give this talk and not give this talk. Free will, part of the self. Okay. Let's see now, in a little bit more detail, what neuroscience says on how the self evolves from brain processes. First, we'll look at specific brain structures involved in the normal expression of the self, and then, like I said before, we'll look into how disorders of the self can give us a mirror into the self by looking how the self is altered. And then we'll suggest how the self may be an emergent process from brain neural activity. So, self, as I said, can be thought of as coming from activity in our neural networks. What neural networks? Are there specific ones? I mean, obviously the brain works together. It's interconnected. There are networks. But interestingly, there are some brain structures which are more active than others when we are thinking about the self, when we are self-aware. And there are different brain structures when we are focused, when we are mind-wandering, daydreaming, or, as we heard from Murray Stein before, fantasy thinking, I think is how he called it. So when we are daydreaming, we lose concentration and unconsciously begin to think of our future, our past, what we're going to do tomorrow, what we're going to have for dinner, or what are we going to do with our life. So it's all over the place. So sometimes it's strictly planning for a dinner engagement, what I'm going to wear, but it's about us or us with other people, us in past encounters and future encounters. It's about self. When we're daydreaming, it's about self, or self as defined as social embedment. Okay. How many times have we found ourselves no longer focused on the book, but rather meandering from one subject to another. And meandering often, like I was saying before, is autobiographical. Different episodes that we've gone through, that we may go through, et cetera, et cetera. The important thing in terms of brain stuff is that it activates a special network. Right now, if you're really paying attention, or if you're reading a book and doing something like that, focused attention, that network is not active. But when we daydream, a special network has been created in the brain. It becomes active when we're doing nothing, because we're not doing nothing. So the self evolves when asleep and dreaming, as well as daydreaming. Of course, when dreaming, like daydreaming, we're not task-driven. At least we haven't decided what the task is going to be until we start dreaming. Our minds, when we're dreaming, have free rein, if you will, where to go. And sometimes we find ourselves in an adventure. Sometimes the dreams seem to be pretty mundane. The point is that if we are in an adventure, it need not be and is not constrained by what we know is possible and what is not possible when we are awake. We constrain how far our minds can go. Some of us have better imaginations than others, but we still know what is physically possible and not. So while we can imagine impossible events, in dreaming we experience the impossible because we don't know it's impossible. And of course that helps the self evolve. It's now experiencing things it had not experienced when awake. So there is an exquisite sense of self when we are dreaming. There is a dissociation between the self, the dream self, and the self that's lying in bed doing the dreaming. The dream self is exquisitely aware of itself. It's in an adventure. It's not aware of the self that's lying in bed, who knows what can and cannot happen. And of course, vice versa. The self lying in bed is not aware of the wonderful adventures the dream self is playing with. So here's an excerpt from a dream that I had. I thought, just at random, I chose this one. Illustrate to some extent what I've been saying about how close the dream self is to the wake self and how removed it is. So I pick up a stick, but it's a piece of rotten wood that I know will break apart if it hits anything solid. The knight on horseback hovers close to the entrance to the front of the tent that I'm in. He's with other men on horseback. I feel pretty trapped inside the tent. I strike my stick against his sword. My stick breaks. It is useless as a weapon. I am getting really scared as they plan to break into the tent I'm in. Now, I know there are analysts in this room. Let's forego this idea of analyzing the dream and just control yourself.
Let me put this back on.
So the dream self in this excerpt probably is thinking and feeling as the self would had he, in this case it's a he, it's me, been awake. For example, in the excerpt, the dream self is aware of the danger he's in. He's scared and he tries to defend himself. The self who's lying in bed sleeping most likely would have been scared and felt the same way. Of course, there are major differences since the wake self is not likely to encounter a knight brandishing a sword in today's world. but the dream self accepts scenarios, bizarre events that his wake self would not. The fact that the dreamer does not question these makes it real for the dream self. This is important because believing that the dream is real, dreaming permits the self to evolve in ways it may not have when awake, when the mind is aware of what is and what is not possible. All kinds of experiences are played out by the dream self, and these experiences, the dream self can experience, in these adventures, the dream self can experience something new. Okay, to summarize this section, the self evolves not only when we are consciously focused and attentive, but also when we are awake and daydreaming, mind-wandering, fantasy thinking, and when we are asleep and dreaming. We can say that Jung's idea that the unconscious and the conscious complement each other is not in contradiction to an evolving self that is based on neural activity in our brains, because this neural activity includes that gives rise to focused attention, that gives rise to daydreaming, that gives rise to dreaming when asleep. Sort of like that unconscious part with the conscious part when we're focused and attentive. So I'd like now to get in a little bit more detail on the specific brain structures that that underlie neural activity, first when we're daydreaming and then when we're dreaming. Neuroscience sees the self as a dynamic collection of neural processes. These processes arise out of brain structures that are connected and integrated into networks. The self seems to emerge, however, or in addition to, from a small cluster of brain areas that are linked into a network. One important network includes the so-called posterior medial cortex. My guess is, though I haven't seen Bob's presentation, he'll be talking about many of the same networks that I'm only going to briefly mention. So, the posterior medial cortex brings together information about the organism and about objects and events with which the organism interacts. The posterior medial cortex includes, sorry if there's anatomy here that's a little bit tongue twisting, but bear with me. The posterior cingulate cortex, the retrosplenial cortex, and the precuneus. Okay, big deal. What do we know about the posterior medial cortex that suggests the self emerges from it? The answer comes from functional brain imaging, PET scans, where we find that the posterior medial cortex is activated when in a variety of tasks involving aspects of the self. For example, self-reference, recalling, oh, this is what I did yesterday, or this is what happened when I went to the jewelry store to buy my mom a ring, or Chanel No. 5 perfume, or future events. And the PMC, posterior medial cortex, also becomes activated when we make moral judgments. an aspect of the self, making moral judgments. When we add the medial prefrontal cortex to the posterior medial cortex, we have what is called the default network. The default network becomes active when we stop concentrating and begin to daydream, fantasy think, let our minds wander. So this network has been found to be involved in conceptual aspects of the self. For example, if I ask you, hey, will you describe your personality to me? What are your personality traits? This area lights up. So parts of the self can be said, therefore, to emerge from activity in this important default network. And, remarkably, the default network is the most highly metabolic, takes up the most energy, uses up the most energy of the entire cerebral cortex. Obviously, a representation of the self, we haven't proven this, but it seems to me that if it's going to take up that much energy, be so metabolically active, when we're daydreaming, it must serve an important function. It's the most metabolically active region when we're daydreaming. Wild. Okay, when we are not daydreaming and we're tending to external stimuli, what's going on, then fortunately we bring what we need to the foreground. Those areas become active, and the default network becomes less active. So when we have to attend to something, the default network becomes less active, and the areas that are required for whatever task we're doing all of a sudden take over. We can also learn about the brain bases of the self by studying patients who have disturbances in the self. And we do this by taking note of which specific areas malfunction. We will see how a brain region can radically alter a sense of self. In this way, each disorder becomes a window on a specific aspect of the self. So I'm going to give a few examples of how the self is affected by specific brain lesions. A lesion to the superior parietal lobe, which in a healthy brain is used in the construction of body image. Okay? Well, damage to this area can lead, and not always, but has led to disownership of the arm. This is an example where one's sense of self has been so altered that the patient denies a part of him or herself exists. The arm doesn't exist anymore. Normally, our sense of self includes a sense, like we said before, embodiment, one of the aspects Ramachandran listed of the self. But when the brain lesion happens to this particular area, superior parietal cortex, we may lose that important aspect of the self, embodiment, by denying a part of us self exists. Another example is damage to the anterior cingulate cortex, and this can cause alien hand syndrome. Well, in alien hand syndrome, the person's hand does something he or she doesn't will it to do. There seems to be two selves, each with a different agenda. One self who wills the hand to move, and one self who can only marvel that the hand is moving without any intention. This alien hand condition affects one's sense of unity. That other aspect of the self, the first one that was listed in the Ramachandran suggested aspects of the self, a sense of unity being important to give us a sense of self. With the alien hand syndrome, a person no longer feels this unity. This is because there are two independent selves that compete with each other. One, the hand is moving, and the other part of the self, the other self, is just looking and saying, I didn't want that hand. The alien hand syndrome. Thank you for the 5-minute warning.
I think you're on time.
Okay, free will. Another important aspect of the self we listed before. Obviously, that is also impaired since the two hands seem to have a will of their own. Okay, damage to the right frontal parietal regions and the so-called TPJ, temporal parietal junction, can lead to out-of-body experiences. In OBE, out-of-body experiences, patients feel that they have actually left their body and maybe hovering over and above it, watching themselves from the outside. The patient feels his body in two or more places in the room. So in the example that you see on the slide, the patient first experienced his body as being elevated above a chair. This is shown in A. Then he reported experiencing a second body that continued to be elevated but left his body, sort of like in that cartoon picture in B. The slide also shows how the patient describes seeing the scene from above his position, from his position above the chair. That's in C. Okay, one final example of a disorder of the self that is brain-based is the Capgras syndrome. In this syndrome, a person visually recognizes, say, his sister. Yeah, that's my sister. She looks like my sister. And wow, but she's not my sister. She's an imposter. And what happens in this syndrome is that there is a mismatch between the emotional feeling and what the person visually sees. His sister looks like his sister, but there is a mismatch between the feeling he knows he has for his sister and what he sees. So this is, the other aspect of the self we listed, social embedment, relationships. In this case, the relationship is fractured, and so is the self. So all of these examples emphasize how our self depends on the health of our brain. We have seen how disturbances in the brain can affect how we sense ourselves and how we interact with other selves around us. So, to summarize this section, we have seen that the self evolves, let's say, in 3 states of consciousness. The self evolves when we consciously engage with other people and with ourselves, and when we daydream, and when we are asleep and dream. We have also seen that the self is dependent upon a healthy brain and how specific aspects of the self changes with specific disorders of the brain. So I saw a 2-minute warning, so I don't want to rush through this, but I'm going to try to do it quickly and succinctly. How might dreams be constructed? The self, in the word self-organization, emphasizes that structure, pattern, or behavior can emerge without instructions from a CEO, from a director, from a that says this is how you put your memory fragments together. This is, okay, you had a feeling, an emotion, you dreamt of your grandfather. Here's how you put it together. That ain't the way it happens. Self-organization. You can look at the slide as I'm talking. There is no central agency that says this is the way the dream should be constructed, but nonetheless, the dream is not random. You have specific things that are important in your life, but how they're put together, how these memory fragments are put together, happens through a biological mechanism called self-organization that occurs throughout nature. A flock of geese, school of fish, a termite nest, which is like a Gothic structure, arches and pillars. Termites don't have a master termite architect, and yet they build a Gothic structure. The inside of a termite's nest has arches and pillars. And there are many examples. So a collective intelligence emerges out of the collective interaction of individual elements, and maybe this is what happens as the self emerges. So I would propose a model of the self as emerging from the collective behavior of our neurons when they join into cooperative networks in the brain. Now, as a result of this collective joining, there is a growing size, a consciousness, and finally a self that emerges. More elaborate behaviors finally leading to the self. It gives a plausible explanation of how something as complicated and complex as the self can emerge from the collective behavior of simple elements, cells in our brains. Now, memory fragments are not simple, but how they're put together can happen through self-organization. And interestingly, since the DNA in all of our cells, including neurons, contains our culture, our myth, it's not in contradiction with Carl Jung's idea of the collective unconscious. So, to wrap up, self-organization is just one model, and there may be others, and I'm going to wrap up because my time is over by thanking Bob Host for the Jung quotes and Sylvia Gober for the edits and the great suggestions on organizing this talk. Thank you.
Thank you for a very well self-organized talk. Okay, shall we? Is there a question here from this audience, and then I'll turn it over to Steve? Yes, there's one in the back. Sylvia?
I have a question about the daydreaming being the most metabolically active state. I know I've heard that the dreaming brain is even more active than the wake brain, so I just wondered where that fits in.
Yeah.
Is the dreaming brain metabolically very active also, more or less?
Yeah, it's true that initially when REM sleep was first looked at with EEG recordings, they said, yikes, this is paradoxical. The brain is as active when it's asleep and dreaming, in REM dreaming, as it is when awake. Well, when brain imaging came out, they realized, yes, that's true on a gross level, but it's selectively active compared to wake active. In other words, the limbic system, as we heard this morning, the amygdala is super active, more so than wake, and some areas like the executive part of the frontal cortex is less active. So yes, in REM sleep, very active, except selectively. Now, it's a recent finding that the default network, that allows us or causes us, who knows, to daydream, that was a surprise, and we don't have an answer for that. I speculated that it's just important. Why else? But we don't know. So, yeah, it came as a big surprise that when you're doing nothing, the brain is doing a lot. So now you tell me why.
Let me check with Steve. Steve, there's another question here, but go to the other side first.
Yeah, let me queue up a few others. England has let me know they have a couple questions, so we'll go to them in just a moment. Then maybe we'll follow with Annie in Asheville. I've got an internet question to ask. So let's do England, Asheville, internet, and then if there's time, back to Sonoma. So England, you're up.
Hi. I think one of them has been partially answered. The first question was, what is the role of the default network in the dreaming process? And the second one was, what difference does telling another make? What's the difference between the dream we don't remember, the dream we do remember and we analyse for ourselves? What's the difference that telling another makes in the therapy?
There are better people than myself to answer.
Thank you for the question. This was actually one we debated that we missed earlier and debated in the hallway. And I think one of the answers from Jeremy Taylor says, the process is a lot quicker that way. Okay, I don't think there's anyone on the panel to answer that, is there? Okay. Maybe what we can do, if we have a few minutes afterwards, if we can if we have time to form a panel, we can get back to that one, because it has been asked two or three times now. Okay. Why don't we take the one from here? Just push it so the light turns.
Yeah. I might have been daydreaming when you were talking about default network. Am I correct that that's kind of like when you're in your car and then you're on idle? Is it sort of that we default to this state of mind when you're still not focused on anything in particular?
I like it better when we say not focused on anything in particular than idle. Yes, what's so interesting about the default network that it is so active when we are not focusing. When we're focusing, it is not active. So here is where the brain is like taking up a lot of energy when we are daydreaming. In fact, if you think about when you have last daydreamed, your mind wandered, you're actually may even go into a lot of detail, spending a lot of energy. Oh, it may seem trivial compared to reading Plato, but you're spending energy. Did I get enough salsa, whatever from my panini? Yeah, so, yeah, it's idle, but it's not idle in the sense of doing nothing.
Okay, thank you. Steve, you have a question from another location.
There's two questions here. Len, why don't you go first?
I'd like to ask you, it seems very evident that a lot of your thinking is informed by some of the principles that we're getting more familiar with in complexity theory, chaos theory, things of that sort, things such as strange attractors and those ideas. And I guess I was particularly curious in how you see the constellation of the self in its interaction with another therapist from that perspective of your physics background and how you've kind of woven that in subtly into some of your presentation today. How the self interacting with another self.
Yeah. When I worked in Brussels with Prigogine on self-organizing systems, there were a few people, analysts, who actually were looking at how some of these ideas can be incorporated in the practice in family systems, looking at the whole system, see how they affect, and also even on one-on-one. I look at it as there isn't one or the other that should be used all the time. There is a time when the analyst needs to serve as a director and sometimes keep open so that the analyst hears what's going on and there can be something that may emerge from non-directed intervention. This is something all analysts know, of course. the self-organizing principle simply states that under certain conditions, a collective intelligence will emerge without forcing it to emerge. And I gave a few examples. I think this is a field that's still open for more thought. How will something new emerge from the interaction between patient and analyst without forcing the action to happen, that it's self-organizing? Usually when we think of self-organizing system, we think of lots of elements, lots of ants, lots of cells, lots of birds flying. But it doesn't have to be, the concept doesn't have to be restricted to some emergence from a lot of simple. It could be an emergence from an interaction between two people, so long as it's not prevented from emerging by forced direction.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more.
One more for Asheville here. Go ahead if you'd like.
Yeah, this is Max. As you talk about the self-evolving from the three spheres and looking at this neurological aspect of, if you will, cause and effect, I wonder what it would be like to reverse that direction and ask the question, does a healthier sense of self actually have a biological effect? I mean, would a self that is constituted in a more healthy way show up as a healthier brain?
Great question, and absolutely so. It's a two-way street. There are so many studies that have shown that we affect our brains by our thoughts, by what we are feeling, so that, when they say brain plasticity, what that means is the brain, the neural activity changes by how we are thinking, how we are feeling. If we're driving a taxi cab in London, whether we're playing the piano or a violin, our brains change by what we think and feel and do. So the answer is it's a two-way street.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Very excellent. We'll need to change that.
Hit the black button.
Okay. I'm being cued to go ahead here, but I need my slides to do so. One of the things that I'm going to be talking about is a little bit of the brain basis for much of what we've already heard. And I don't want to be too reductionist here, but there are some amazing studies that have come out just in the last 10 years, well, in the last 15 years, with the neurology of dreaming, particularly in the REM state, and the REM state functioning of the brain, but also in just the basic waking state neurology of those centers that have found to have been active in the brain state. And as you read some of these studies, it's amazing how they shed light not only on what some of the things that Jung said, which is what I want to really share with you today, but also on shed some light on what some of the speakers have already said today, particularly talking about the transformational process that Stanley Krippner talked about, how a lot of this is driven by emotion, as Ernest enlightened us with, and then also a peek into the self-organization process that occurs perhaps in how a dream is driven in the frontal regions of the cortex that are active in the dream case. You can almost see how the various centers of the brain work together and get together, providing information to self-organize the dream plot. So let's go ahead and get started with the slides here, and then hopefully we'll have some time afterwards to bring everyone up. Okay. What I want to talk about, as I said, is a few of Jung's writings, some of the statements and observations, just really three of them here that some have been covered, but some have not. And the research studies suggested of support for these things, and then some of them were pretty fun, supporting observations from some dream case examples. So these are the three writings from Jung that are theorizations that I'm going to be discussing. The first is dreams as an expression of the unconscious. Secondly, symbol as an emotionally charged picture language that emerges from the dream. And thirdly, compensation and the transcendence function. I put those together because they tend to follow each other or join each other within a dream state in the process of transcendence. So one of the first things, let's talk about the first one, the unconscious origins of dreams. One of the things that Jung said is that dreams are the most readily accessible expression of the unconscious, and that they are the unconscious process obtruding on consciousness. And let's take a look at perhaps some studies that showed this to be somewhat the case. Much of what I'm going to be talking about today comes from a number of neurological brain scan studies, beginning with PET scan studies back in the late 90s and extending into the early 2000s by Marquette, Braun, Nofzinger, and others and their colleagues, and a number have been replicated ever since. And some of the results are reported in many, many documents, research documents, as well as some books by Hobson, Scott, and other researchers since then. I put some of the references up here if you wish to go to those and take a deeper look into those studies. But what I've done here is I put together a collage of the centers that tended to be modulated and demodulated. They essentially lighted and became activated or deactivated in the REM state. I'm going to be talking mainly about REM state dreams, which are the more vivid state of dreams. As was pointed out earlier, we dream all night, and basically in many stages of sleep. But these are going to be mainly focusing on what happens in this REM state. And what shows up here is that the centers that are demodulated during REM, that is pretty much deactivated or more deactive, are primarily related to the executive functions in cortical regions of the brain typically associated with waking consciousness. So consciousness as we know it in the waking state tends to be diminished, of course, in the dream state. And those centers which are activated, some of them more highly activated at times than in the waking state, tend to perform their processing functions below the threshold of awareness or prior to conscious awareness. Sometimes we'll get an intuitive feeling about something and only later, a few seconds later, really understand what it is that we're deciding from a more unconscious level. Now, some of these centers include the emotional, what people might call the emotional brain, the limbic centers of the brain, and also some of the medial frontal regions that deal with conflict processing, learning, and a number of other functions, which I'll be talking about later in the talk. Now, here's kind of just a curious example of a dream commenting on its own unconscious origins. It doesn't really prove anything about the unconscious, but it was just an interesting example. The dream was, I dreamed that the sky was boiling and the ground shaking. It was the end of the earth and all mankind. I was on a mountaintop, but water was rising all around me. Suddenly the clouds parted, and I heard a voice say, the water is only your unconscious. Jump in and you'll be fine. So if there's any doubt. Okay. The second concept I wanted to, and I'll be using the basis of that brain diagram throughout this thing, and we'll be referring back to those centers. So you'll see how that evolves over time as I talk about these different concepts that Jung brought up. But the second one is the concept of symbol, and what he called it an emotionally charged picture language. Ernest Hartmann told us a lot about how that evolves in dreams through the central image and how it actually drives our dreams in many ways. But what Jung said is in dreams, the unconscious aspect of an event is revealed, where a concept can express its unconscious meaning not as a rational thought, but as a symbol, an emotionally charged picture language. And here's an example of that. The unconscious of this particular statement in a dream. This dreamer, the conscious event with the dreamer was pretty simple. He just celebrated his 45th birthday, had a wonderful time at the birthday party and whatnot. But that night, here was the dream. I dreamed of a car with a license plate that read, Hyde 45. So it's fairly apparent here that the unconscious aspect of this person's turning 45 was the feeling a little bit upset about being that age and a little reluctant to want to advertise the fact that he had turned it. So this is just a very simplistic example of how that unconscious aspect feeds into our dreams. Now, here's another example. The conscious event was that the dreamer was wholeheartedly embracing a new spiritual belief. It was, however, in conflict with and threatening to the teachings of his Latin American upbringing. So he dreamed that I was in an airplane which landed in a spiral motion on the rim of a large circle in a Latin American village. In the center of the circle was a priest dressed in black with a gun protecting the village from my intrusion. So here you can see the unconscious aspect of this wonderful event that the individual was having in embracing this new belief that made him feel so very, very good. But yet there was this unconscious counter myth concept there, or this was probably the myth, I think, as Stan would say, and this new belief was bringing up a counter myth that was in conflict with each other. So let's take a look at the statement that Jung said. He said the unconscious aspect of an event is revealed not as a rational thought, but as a symbol, an emotionally charged picture language. And let's see if we can find support from that from a neurological sense. First thing, not as a rational thought. Well, we know that in the dreaming state, or at least in the REM state, the executive and working memory centers of the brain are diminished. So there goes rational thought. There's absence of rational conscious thought, and absence of reflection or recall on waking events. So this was a very accurate observation that Jung made with regards to the neurology of what was taking place, even though he didn't have a PET scanner. He says that the information or material arises as a symbol, a pictorial language. Ernest described this very, very well in his talk. But the neurological support for this is the part of the brain that you're actually sensing the imagery with is not your primary visual cortex, which seems to be diminished in dreaming, but your visual association cortex and a number of parts of the inferior parietal region that create those associations. So you're actually creating associations with the stuff being processed inside. They're, quote, symbols, a pictorial language, or a picture of your feelings. So the influence of this center being and other associative centers being active is, as Ernest said, the information is being represented as associations and picture metaphor, and this is being stimulated through the thalamic connection to the limbic systems and other areas that are processing the dream material. And bringing in sensory and motor elements as well and combining them totally in a spatial organization into this thing that we call the dream. And finally, Jung recognized that the pictorial language was emotionally charged. The central image was an example of that. And we can see that that is the case when we look at the fact that this emotional brain, this huge limbic system, is one of the things that lights up when we dream. And the influence that tends to have on the dream and on the researchers who have basically studied this is that many researchers now believe, this is one quote from Seligman and Yellen, that dreams selectively process emotionally relevant memories via interplay between the cortex, that visual association cortex, and others, and the limbic system. So there appears to be, there's a lot of thinking that this is a feedback loop where the dream is evolving by itself or self-organizing, as David said, by that interaction taking place. Also, the amygdala, there's also thinking that it's the amygdala which orchestrates the dream. It's much more than the amygdala, but the amygdala seems to provide that emotional energy that orchestrates the dream. And that as Ernest said, the imagery contains the feeling state of the dreamer. I like that statement very much. I don't think you mentioned it here, but I think the statement that the imagery contains the feeling state of the dreamer is important when you're working with your dreams. Okay, so let's go on to Jung's idea of compensation. Compensation, what he said is the general function of dreams is to restore psychological balance by producing dream material that reestablishes psychic equilibrium. And he says the compensatory role of dreams is to recognize and present our personal motives and compensate for deficiencies and distortions, to bring the conscious mind back to reality and warn of the dangers of our present course. Okay, a mouthful there, but let me give you an example of how this shows up in a fairly simple but dramatic dream. The attitude, this particular woman was raised in a very strict Christian background, and she was taught that to think evil thoughts was as bad as to do evil things, the evil deeds. And so what occurred with her is she would frequently try to suppress this evil side of herself that she considered evil by going through this massive prayer ritual whenever she had evil thoughts. And we all know what happens when we try to suppress that side of ourselves. It creates a shadow that we can't really deal with. And as you'll see, that's what happened here. This was the dream she finally had. The dream just finally had enough. And self-correction needed to take place, and so she dreamed that this evil person had come alive again, and she feared that an entity was at work. So she said, I went through a ritual of exorcism to eliminate the evil person. So here's this personal motive that Jung talked about that comes out in our dreams to present us with the face of what we are essentially doing, thinking, and believing. And then it switches it. It twists it, flips it over by compensating for that particular myth. And so the dream goes on. But the more I tried, the darker the sky became. In this case, a total surprise to her, because she thought that the more she tried, the brighter things would get. So here's the dream beginning to compensate, and suddenly a voice said, stop, you're only making it worse. So the dream just basically came right out and said it. So the compensatory aspect of dreaming came out fairly clearly in that one example. And now what I'd like to, right? Boom. So now what I'd like to do is tie that in a little bit with the transcendent function that Jung talked about, and talk a little bit about the some of the support for this that might be coming from waking state neurological studies. Now, what Jung said is the transcendent function is an aspect of self-regulation of the psyche that makes transition from one attitude to another organically possible, manifesting as a new attitude. Okay? So he saw a transcendent function of a dream being something that's actually taking place in the dream, a mechanism taking place in the dream that allows the transition to take place. So I wanted to see if there really is something taking place neurologically that could be considered a mechanism or a process that actually brings this about, whether it be self-organization or something more methodological. Let's see what may bring this about. So here it's, what is it about dreams that makes transcendence organically possible? We talked a little bit earlier about how in dreams, more things are possible in terms of the creative process in dreams than are possible perhaps in the waking state because of the hyperconnectivity and the ability to dream, to make more connections freely. Now, what Jung said is dreams brings consciousness and unconscious material together to arrive at a new attitude. Ernest's statement, I think, fits this very nicely. I don't think you talked about that necessarily here, Ernest, but in his new book, that just came out. He talks about how dreams operate much like the brain learns, weaving new material into established memory, making new connections, expressed in picture metaphors that reveal new perspectives and insights. I mean, there's a lot of thoughts in that one statement there, but it's not only weaving of the material together, but the picture metaphor itself reveals the perspectives and insights. So let's see if we can see this in an example. Here's an example of new connections taking place. This person's this woman, her conscious attitude was, my husband is the source of our marital problems. Now, I've never heard that said before, but so she reported this dream to me in one of the workshops we did. She said, I have a recurrent dream of being terribly angry with my husband, who I'm always running away from. These dreams continued into one night. I turned around and faced my husband and looked at his face. It was my father's face. So it's very clear here that the dream is making what Jung would call this unconscious connecting, bringing the unconscious material that the woman was totally unwilling to face, that I hate my father, or whatever factors it took on, and was rather projecting it on to the husband. And so the dream was making this unconscious connection, revealing it in a compensatory factor to the dreamer, pretty much in a way that she couldn't ignore it, and she certainly couldn't when we talked about the dream in that workshop. Let's take another example of the transcendent function. Here was a case where the subject was fired from a much-needed job. Their conscious attitude was, I have no future, it's all over for good. This is like about the second or third time the person had been let go from a job, so he was in a really, really bad state at this time. But here was the dream. I dreamed a building fell on me, and I was crushed under the rubble. All went dark, and I stopped breathing. I knew that I was dead, and it was all over. There was no future. Then I became another person in the dream who was strong and determined and dug my body out of the rubble. Suddenly I came back to life and realized that I could go on. So you see here not only a compensation activity in the dream, but a real true transformation pictured in the dream, which actually came true in waking life. A transformation was made in this person where after this dream, they actually went off and started their own company and became fairly successful at it. So let's take a look at this particular dream and see what might be taking place here. I dreamed a building fell on me and was crushed under the rubble. All went dark and I stopped breathing. I knew I was dead. It was all over for good. There seems to be an anomalous attitude here in the individual that was detected and then presented in the dream. Then I became another person in the dream who was strong and determined. There appears to be a resolution initiated in the dream, a mechanism or to make this transition organically possible, as Jung would say. There's also tends to be some compensating cues, and this sense of knowing that I can't recall if it was you, David, or Ernest talked about, the sense of knowing taking place in the dream. That said, when I became another person and I was strong and determined, there was a sense that somewhere inside was this other self that was much greater than the self that had been just diminished. He dug my body out of the rubble. So here was a scenario, a dream scenario being tested. Let's try this out. And suddenly I came back to life and realized that I could go on. So now here was an emotional reinforcement of the result. The result was as evidently the dream maker had intended, and it's being emotionally reinforced. Now, let's see if that really is a process that can be supported by neurological activity in the brain, in the dreaming brain during the REM state. These are I listed some of the centers here, particularly in the medial and the frontal part of except the insulas and around the limbic system, but that are active in this REM state. It turns out when you look at the waking state studies, that have gone on in the last 5 to 10 years on what these centers have been found to be doing, what functions they perform. Those centers do form a conflict detection function. And below is some of the studies. I'm not going to read through every little bit of this, but there's some interesting things said about how those centers perform in the waking state, and they are awake in the dream state. So you can't necessarily translate one to the other perfectly, but there is a chance that they are operating very similarly in the dream state, and if they are, possibly forming the functions we and Jung are observing taking place in the dream. For instance, the basal ganglion detects anomalies that something is wrong. The anterior cingulate monitors conflict and anomalies. The orbifrontal cortex is involved in inspection of events that deviate from expectation. So here are potential mechanisms active during REM sleep which can detect that there is a problem and thus initiate a dream. Secondly, the question is, are there mechanisms that initiate resolution and mediate the process of resolution, or this in the dream process? There we go. There are various studies that show that these centers, the anterior cingulate, basal ganglion, orbifrontal cortex, and all, actually do some problem resolution. Let me get this up here, because I can't read the screen over there. The anterior cingulate, for instance, has been found to mediate action to choose between conflicting perceptions. In other words, it seems to be somewhat of a mediator, if not an organizer, of the direction the dream is taking. The basal ganglion generates paradoxical behavior metaphors, and it, along with the orbifrontal cortex, are involved in novelty related decision making. So at least it seems like we have the machinery running during the dream to be able to initiate resolution. Goal detected scenarios. Now this is kind of an imagined and tested. Do dreams test solutions? And it appears that at least we have the equipment running to be able to do that. The anterior cingulate has been shown in the waking state to imagine or observe an outcome and monitor the consequences. Imagining an outcome is much like creating a dream scenario. Let's imagine a test scenario, okay, and let's observe how that works. The medial prefrontal cortex is involved in plan generation, goal-directed behaviors, reward processing, introspective self-referential behavioral simulation, and rehearsal. So it appears like centers are active that are able to create dream scenarios, goal-directed scenarios, and test them, at least as they have been described in the waking state. Now, the next question is, do dreams really provide cues? Do they really provide directions in a way that influences the action in the dream? And is there this sense of knowing that was described earlier, I think in David's talk? Is there some intelligence or wisdom within the dream that seems to be acting? And when I looked into the studies on the various active centers, there was a huge, there's 5 of these major centers here that all provide cues into the process. And this may fall into the self-organization that David talked about, because here's all these centers jumping in with some degree of organization from the anterior cingulate, but it tends to look like a little bit like a beehive in structuring this dream. And to move on, the next question is, as we saw in that last dream, if they come up with solutions, a solution that tends to be the expected solution in the dream, or tends to go in a rewarding direction, because many of these centers work on self-reward. Is there a reinforcement, emotional reinforcement in the dream, or as Ernest would say, this emotional learning process taking place? It's been also called adaptive learning or extinction learning. So when we look at some of the centers that are active, we find that the anterior cingulate, let me move on, selects the appropriate response based on anticipated and valuing rewards. Basal ganglion selects which response to make or inhibit. The orbifrontal cortex is involved in decision-making, expectation, regulating, and planning behavior so as to change our ongoing behavior. The orbifrontal cortex and Brodmann Area 25 is central to extinction learning. And Nielsen and Levine in 2007 indicated that these networks, he was talking about a grouping of these networks, serve the adaptive function of fear memory extinction. Now, they're talking about the waking state, but if these centers are active also in the REM and dreaming state, it's likely that they could play a very similar function. And we can see these things, actually observe them happening in dreams. Certainly Jung observed them. He didn't have a way of scanning the brain and finding out all this stuff is active. But he certainly observed these things occurring in the dream. So let's just take a couple examples here. Almost out of time. Take a couple examples of how those functions that I just went over might show up in the dream. Here was the event was the person was offered a teaching appointment in an area he had been away from for many, many years. His conscious attitude at that point was, there is no way I can resurrect my old talents. They're gone forever. There's the myth. The dream was, I wandered through the desert and saw an old rusty car. I looked inside and found a man who was not moving. I was going to give him up for dead. Now here you can see a conflict detection process taking place in the dream. Something's wrong. There's a conflict between the inner unconscious self, the counter myth, and the myth. But my unknown companion urged me to wake the man. Now here was the resolution initiated, and there was some compensating cues coming in. There was urgings in the process to actually take a specific action. I argued that it was useless. Now we can see an argument taking place. There actually is this mediation kind of function taking place that David talked about in the self-organization process, where there does seem to be a central mediation, but there's other cues coming in from other parts of the brain or the dreaming process. I said, but after much discussion, I reluctantly gave in and shook the man. So here's the scenario being tested now. When I did, both the man and the car came to life, and the car transformed into a newer car. So here we have not only a compensating message in the dream, but a pictured transformation taking place. One more, I think. My company restructured, eliminating top executives. I'm holding onto uncertain internal opportunities. In other words, he didn't want to leave the company. He kept trying to find something inside that satisfied him, but he feared everything that was there was not in alignment with his career. He felt his career was ending. Here's the dream. I am a passenger in a boat on a dark underground river trying to find a way out, and a position in the windows where I can see daylight. So here you can see the conflict detected. You can see the awakening activity displayed metaphorically in the dream, looking for other positions inside the company that would light up his day. The tour guide behind me, finally, a tour guide appears in this one dream. This dream went on for a number of nights, and all night this one time he was in this dark underground tunnel. Finally, a tour guide appears and said behind him, points to an opening in front and says, you can walk out that door to the front of the boat. And so here was a resolution imagined that came up within the dream, and cues provided. Okay, so something within the brain had done this. I didn't understand and was reluctant, since it seemed too risky. But finally, at his constant urging, so here you can see the mediation taking place again, an argument between the conscious and unconscious, as Jung might point out, a mediation behind the self-organizing process, as David might point out. So I walked out the door. So now the scenario is being tested. It's the scenario that was, now one of the things the anterior cingulate does is it selects scenarios that are based on what it anticipates is a solution that will lead to reward. That's one of the things it's been seen to do in waking life. And you can kind of see it doing here, because it says, when I did, the boat emerged from an ice cave into a bright, beautiful, sunlit setting of calm water. So you can see a reinforcement taking place. And there was a learning that tended to carry over into waking life, because immediately after this dream, the dreamer did leave the company and did find a new job, which turned out to be a fantastic job. And so there was obviously some sort of learning taking place. My concluding remarks is, I think there is evidence from these PET studies and other fMRI studies that centers which are activated and deactivated in REM affect dream content, and as anticipated from the known waking functions of those centers. It's certainly not one-on-one, but there is some degree of carryover between waking life functionality and dream functionality, not just my conclusion, but that of other researchers. But further neurological studies on those waking functional centers that I've shown you here, because these are a little newer than some of the ones that were done necessarily 5 years ago when those first PET scans were done. These are suggestive that the dreaming brain has a potential capacity in REM for processing material in a manner supportive of Jung's observations. Now, these conclusions can only be deduced and correlate, from correlations, because at this point there's no data nor way to show exactly what brain centers are activated during any part of any dream, and nor exactly what role they play. But I think when we look at the gross data at this level, the overall picture looks fairly promising, that Jung was observing something that was really, in effect, taking place neurologically in the brain. So thank you. Can I take a couple questions and maybe have some of my colleagues up here to form a little panel at the end? Would that be okay, David and Stan, if you'd like to come up, and Ernest? Okay, any questions? Yes.
I was wondering if you might think that lucidity, as it's been shown in the lab to exist, is a good, pointer that the transcendence or the transcendent function is operable, because it does bring the conscious and the unconscious together in the dream itself.
Yeah, I did not study lucidity in the way I did here, though. So I don't have a good. I mean, I can give you opinions, but I don't have any good neurological data to support this similar kind of process taking place in lucidity. The different brain centers actually activate in lucidity. Some of those more in the frontal regions that are more responsible for consciousness and will, force of will, tend to activate in the lucid realm. And that kind of changes the picture, because suddenly you have executive function now entering the brain or entering the dream process, and it's no longer self-organizing. It's no longer necessarily hyperconnecting, although that process still takes place in the background. You've got much more ego power in the dream. Although those of you who lucid dream fully recognize when you think that you're in control of the dream, that ain't going to happen. The dream tells you differently. So there is still the dream process taking place in the background. It's just that you have a little bit more willpower to drive your actions in the dream. Ernest, you want to come up and sit? David? Stan, would you like to come up? We'll see if we can spend the last few minutes answering the questions as a panel.
Should we also inquire if Steve has some questions?
Yes, Steve, do you have some questions from the other sites?
Yeah, let's go ahead. I've got a internet question, which I'll ask first, and then we'll check in with both the actual audience and the English audience if they have ones as well. And again, home audience, there may be time to email in a question still. Okay, let me read one that we have here. Could you please speak of the intruder/shadow big dreams? I have approximately one shadow dream per year, a dark figure watching and attempting to intrude on my life. I wake with a heart pounding and a frightened state. Very memorable imagery. That's from Denise. Any thoughts on a big dream?
The shadow.
Shadow.
Can you speak about the shadow? Yeah.
Well, most of the people who are watching this or listening to it know about Jung's concept of the shadow. This is an especially valuable concept, I think, because the shadow is the discarded, neglected, often repressed aspect of the psyche that we don't want to have anything to do with. And yet, there can be treasure in the shadow. It can be very valuable if it is brought into the surface and if it is in some way rehabilitated and integrated. Now, there are many reasons why the shadow develops. Somebody could grow up in a very fundamentalist Christian home where dancing is forbidden. And so they look upon dancing as being the work of the devil. They don't want to have anything to do with dancers. And yet in their dream, they dream about themselves dancing. And they say, oh, this is a terrible thing. It means I'm going to hell. It means that I'm engaging in forbidden activities. But then let's say that they go to counseling or psychoanalysis or simply talking with friends. They say, well, you know, maybe dancing isn't so bad. Dancing has been very important in religious rituals. There are spiritual dancers. Why don't you try it out? Why don't you go to a sacred Christian dance, for example, or go and do some reading in the library. Jung would send his patients to libraries to do some library research. And let's say that the dreamer did that and actually went to a very innocuous dance, a folk dance or a square dance, and had some fun. And thought, you know, this is not something that's sinful and evil. This is a place where people can get together and express themselves and have some joy in their lives. And pretty soon that person has integrated that shadow, that dancing part of oneself, and the dancing in the dream starts to disappear. But then the dreamer might go on from there, study dancing, and see that there's a whole metaphor of dance of life. And they've been keeping themselves from not only dancing with the shadow, but dancing with the life force itself. So what at one point was forbidden and the shadow suddenly comes a new guiding myth for them. And they have a new perspective on life simply because they went into their dream, found a part of themselves that they had neglected and despised, and sort of domesticated it, integrated it, and eventually made it an important part of their whole psyche.
You want to answer some of that?
Now, can I just ask just a quick comment or question, because I'm not really a Jungian. I'm simple-minded. Now I hear an awful lot of nightmares which involve dark figures or monster. Most common nightmare in children is a monster is chasing me. I usually take that just simple-mindedly as a picturing of fear, or maybe picturing a parent who's out of control. But would you good Jungians insist that all of those nightmare figures are shadows and should be interpreted as part of the child's self? I mean, I'm a little bit skeptical.
Yeah. I don't say all. I would say some. I would say in some cases, children are projecting, taking their parent image and using it as the monster. And sometimes children, especially children in many of the war-torn countries of the world, deal with evil every day. People who are trying to bomb them and kill them and wipe out their ethnic group. And so there are real monsters they're dealing with. So that monster in the nightmares can represent a number of things for children.
I'll answer. I wanted to answer a little bit too, because we saw the shadow-like characters show up in the examples that I gave. But rather than being monstrous and scary, they were the guiding voice that was trying to get the fella to shake the guy in the car. It was this internal, unconscious self that tended to be emerging. And one of the things that was interesting in the studies I did of some of the more recent neurological studies of those parts of the brain were that the medial prefrontal cortex has this sense of knowing associated with it. It was pretty dramatic. And you could see it in those dream cases where these guiding dark characters, the voice behind the guy in the boat, the fellow that was wanting him to shake the guy in the car, were all these shadowy dark characters, but they had this sense of wisdom about them. They knew that internally this person had something more in them than they knew themselves externally and consciously. So it can take on a number of different forms, whether it be nightmarish or it be this helpful inner side. And you can see it in those particular dreams. Any other questions?
We have a question here in Asheville. And
Okay.
just to remind you that it's almost 5 o'clock here, and so we'll be needing to end pretty much right on time. So we got about 5 minutes left. Let's ask a question here, then we'll check with England and wrap up with Sonoma. Go ahead.
Sounds great.
To the speaker who spoke about the PTSD dreams and working with the veterans, I was wondering if after the work with the changing of the myth and the taking of the action, if the dream content actually changed or if there was a lessening only of the dream itself.
Did you hear this? It's when you work with PTSD victims.
Yes.
With dreams and can actually change the dreams to bring about some sort of mastery. Was the rest of your question is how does that change them in waking life?
If there was a change or transformation in the dreaming process itself, or if the dream
did the dream change?
lessened.
Yeah. Did the dream change when you went through that process?
Yes, remember that I'm not one of those people who is a big advocate of changing dreams. I sort of like the dream the way it is. And so with a post-traumatic stress disorder dream, I don't recommend changing the dream. I mean, those people who are dead in the dream are not going to come back to life in waking life. But it's the perspective. Remember that it's not what happens on the battlefield, it's how we interpret what happens on the battlefield. And so the soldier kills a child by mistake, haunts that soldier for the rest of his or her life, and comes up again in these PTSD nightmares. That can't be undone. You don't bring that child back to life. But you can reinterpret what happens, and you can say, look, I did a terrible thing. I pray to the child for forgiveness. I pray to whatever gods there may be for forgiveness. But I'm not going to stop there. I'm going to do volunteer work with children. I'm going to give some money to save our children. I'm going to be kinder to my own children. And I'll do this in memory of the child that I killed accidentally. So you see, the personal myth is changing. Now, this doesn't happen automatically. They do homework. They redream that dream and the new interpretation in their imagination 5 or 6 times a day. They wake up in the middle of the night with that. Immediately when they wake up in the middle of the night, they take a deep breath and redream the dream with its new interpretation. They work on it. In a PTSD nightmare, you cannot only change the meaning of the dream, I think you have to change the brain. You have to get the emotion drained out of the dream. And that changes the brain, it changes the interpretation of the dream, and eventually it changes the person. And so then eventually the nightmare does change. It is less emotional, it can have that little positive spin. Sometimes it can just stop altogether. the point that I'm making is not going to do it by its own. Emotional downloading is a function of dreaming, and in post-traumatic nightmares, it's stopped. It's stuck. It's like a record that's stuck and goes over and over again. Yeah, you can help that change. You can help it get unstuck, but it needs diligent work. It needs homework assignments. It needs rehearsal. It needs revising the interpretation of what happened, talking to friends, talking with a psychotherapist, even seeking spiritual help. You work on that, and you can make a change. And once the PTSD nightmare changes, very often the other symptoms of PTSD start to change also, because the very personal myth that's promulgating and reinforcing the PTSD is now changed.
Well, thank you so much. I'm aware we'll probably lose our connection probably in a few seconds and maybe wire to go off right at 5. But just in case, I want to thank everybody. Everybody's done such a marvelous job today, from Murray, who's no longer listening, most likely, and to Margaret, to the 4 of you. You've done just a marvelous job. So let me thank you once again.
Thank you.
So we'll sign off at this point, and we'll talk later.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.